getting vaccinated in a big city like this, a big diverse city. And thank you to the team who did it. But our job is not over. And my job continues to be working with Dr. Davila to make sure that, yes, we recover strongly from the pandemic and that we do move on to the next stage of our lives economically and socially and otherwise, but that we keep our focus on the task that's in front of us, which is to confront COVID-19, to get people vaccinated as a very top priority, and to make sure that the collective health of people in the city is preserved and enhanced to the greatest possible extent. Now, I should say that while the pace of activity has obviously leveled off compared to where it was at the beginning when no one was vaccinated, hundreds of people are still getting their vaccinations. Just to look at the numbers from yesterday, more than 1,000 doses were delivered yesterday with 100 people visiting Metro Hall, so that's a start on its very first day. Interestingly enough to me, 128 of those doses delivered yesterday were first doses. And I take great heart from that because there are obviously people who have concluded just now, after all this time, that they should start the process of getting themselves fully vaccinated. 600 plus of them were fourth doses, 30 kids doses, so 1,036 doses yesterday at 5 fixed sites and 12 mobile clinics. And we still have a task in front of us to make sure that people get those third and fourth doses, because we're at around 90 for the first and second doses, and they do make a difference. I can tell you, I'm totally convinced, and I'm no doctor or scientist. I've deferred to Dr. Davila and the other wonderful people on our Toronto Public Health team for that advice and for that expertise. But I am convinced that in terms of my own encounter with COVID, that the reason that the symptoms basically passed in a day and a half, although I did serve my 7 days of isolation, and I say serving because Dr. Davila knows I consider it to be like cruel and unusual punishment, so I sympathize with others who've had to do it. But I will just say that I believe the reason that my symptoms passed in a day and a half at my age was because I had been triple vaccinated. I don't think there's any question about that. And that not only did I have no need to go to the hospital, as I said to people at the time, 7 days spent at home, I only had to spend 5, but I spent 2 more to be sure. 7 days spent at home was way better than 7 days spent in the hospital, and that continues to be true. And if people get a third vaccination, where we need some numbers to keep rising there, they are going to protect themselves against a far worse consequence if they happen to get COVID-19. The facts remain the same. They have not changed. If anything, there is more and more evidence every day that the odds of ending up battling COVID-19 in the hospital are much higher. You are more likely, much more likely to end up in the hospital if you haven't had your third dose. That's a fact, borne out by evidence all over the world, including right here in the city of Toronto. And it could be, the difference between whether you spend your time recovering if you get it at home or whether you spend it in the hospital. So I will just say to you that our goal continues to be to draw attention to Team Toronto's vaccination efforts, to encourage people to get vaccinated. The 7 million doses is an incredible, wonderful milestone for which I am very grateful as mayor for the cooperation of the people who went and got those doses and for the people who administered them, which is a very broad team of people, as you know, right across the city. And I would just say, let's keep up the good work. And let's find ourselves in a position where we have one of these milestones to celebrate in the next number of weeks. And we will continue to roll out things that draw attention to this. You know, when we have, Vax and Shop or Vax and Ride or all these different things, yes, they're meant to sort of focus on the targeted clientele we're trying to get vaccinated. And we know very much where the effort has to be made the most. But it's also to just continue to keep awareness up. And I thank the media for the fact you've helped us to keep conveying this message that we're not done yet. We are not done yet. This pandemic is not over yet. We have to prepare ourselves for the possibility it may recur a bit in the fall and prepare as best we can for that. And so I just urge people to please not conclude that it's over. Please get vaccinated yourself, and please encourage others you know who have not yet been vaccinated to get vaccinated. And on that note, I will ask our very capable medical officer of health if she would come forward and offer her remarks for today.
Thank you, Mayor Tory, and good morning, everyone. So as you've just heard, 7 million COVID-19 vaccine doses administered in a city of 3 million people. This is an absolutely incredible accomplishment. I simply cannot say it strongly enough. 1 year ago, if you had told me that we would reach this milestone in Toronto, I don't think I would have believed it. Last year at this time, in fact, only 40% of Ontarians had received one dose of COVID-19 vaccine. And if you remember, at that time, we were just beginning to receive large shipments of vaccine. We were rolling out doses according to age and in neighborhoods that had experienced high rates of COVID-19 infection. I remember that time as well, while we were in the middle of that first leg of an extraordinary vaccine campaign, that I too received my first dose of COVID-19 vaccine. In fact, it was on almost exactly a year ago to the date, May 6th, 2021, at Cloverdale Immunization Clinic, along with thousands of other Torontonians. What a long way we have come together. Fast forward 12 months later, and almost 92% of Torontonians over the age of 12 have 2 doses of vaccine on board, and 57% of city residents have received at least 3 doses. Toronto Public Health and our Team Toronto partners have worked flat out to ensure Toronto residents have access to their next COVID-19 vaccine dose. Thank you to each and every one of them for their hard work, their dedication, and their sacrifice to get Toronto vaccinated. And now here we are, May 2022. We have a better understanding of the COVID-19 virus, and we have better treatment and better protection options available to us. And we continue to have the protective benefit of vaccine. And we know the more vaccinated you are, the better your protection from hospitalization, from ICU admission, or death should you become infected with COVID-19. In fact, according to Public Health Ontario, across the province, an estimated 6,000 hospitalizations were averted during the Omicron wave because of the high rate of third dose vaccine uptake across the province. And the protective benefit of vaccine is also seen right here in Toronto, where our local data show that between December 2021 and April 2022, the risk of hospitalization amongst unvaccinated individuals was about double that for those with 3 doses. That's why we at Toronto Public Health continue to host COVID vaccine clinics like the one we're in today, all over the city, making it as easy as possible for people to access the protective benefit of vaccine. My message today to Toronto residents is simply this. Please, get your next dose. Your next dose is the best thing that you can do to protect yourself, to protect your family, and ultimately to protect our community. So with that, I will wrap up my remarks, and I believe we're prepared to take a few questions.
Thanks, everybody. We'll not take questions from the media. It's 1 question, 1 follow-up. First up, we have Courtney Hales from CP24.
Good morning. This question's for Mayor Tory. You mentioned your concern about the drop in demand for booster shots. What do you think is behind the spike in demand for the first shot and then this pretty significant drop, people who are hesitating for the 3rd dose?
We have been trying to find an answer to that question, for quite some time. We talk about it all the time in our meetings because you'd say, well, if someone stepped up and had a first and then a second dose and understood that the maximum protection was provided by 3, wouldn't it just be logical? And we've actually done surveys of people to say, well, why? Because we know who they are. We know who the people are that have had 2 doses and haven't had the 3rd. And so we've literally been in touch with them by email and by phone to say, first of all, we encourage you to get the 3rd. And secondly, could you tell us why you've delayed in doing so? And, to be frank, without remembering exactly what the answers were, a lot of people, I think, had that sense we're trying to encouraged them to get out of, which is a sense of comfort that they'd had to. You'll remember there was a day when we described that as being fully vaccinated. I think it's still an expression that's still used, and it does provide a significant degree of protection. I'm not getting out of my territory here, but I think a lot of people said, well, I did too. A lot of other people, I think, maybe thought the pandemic was over, and therefore any advice we had about getting 3 doses was not necessary anymore. And I guess part of the reason we're here today, beyond celebrating, if I can call it that, the 7 million doses, is to say to people, the maximum protection you do get is from 3 or even 4 doses. Not everybody's eligible for 4, but pretty much everybody's eligible for 3. You should get the 3. I'm able to speak as is Doc. Well, she hasn't had COVID yet, but I have. And I'm absolutely convinced that having had 3 put me in a better place than 2 or 1 or 0 in terms of my own absolutely rapid return to complete health and being able to be back at my job. It doesn't matter what my job is, just I was able to be back at work and back with my family and back living my life and not being in the hospital. So we continue to work at that. I will also say this. We continue with our efforts to address areas of the city, leave alone demographics, areas of the city and certain demographics that reside in those areas that are under-vaccinated on the 3rd dose substantially, and with children too. And that's been a challenge from us all the way through. And we've done a job in this city that I think is second to none anywhere in the world in terms of deploying community ambassadors and others to, work at overcoming some of those hesitations and getting people more comfortable. And again, we continue to make progress, but it's just very painstaking. But we're going to keep at this. We are not, we're here today because we're not saying, oh, well, it's enough and we'll just forget about it. The stakes are too important. And we're having, discussions all the time about young people, people that have had 2 doses but not 3, people that live in some of the more marginalized neighborhoods. Every day we're talking about these things and trying to find new ways to get to them.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Davila. Are you able to speak to what wastewater levels are showing right now in terms of how many cases we could be seeing in Toronto at this time?
So thanks for the question. I don't know that I can speak specifically to how the wastewater levels might correlate to an exact number of cases, but I can tell you that our wastewater surveillance for the most recent period certainly shows general declines in respect of the viral activity and the virus signal that's being picked up there. So this is a good sign, and it matches with what we're seeing overall with respect to incidents of COVID-19 in the city. That yes, there is still some activity, absolutely. We are still in that 6th wave, but we are seeing positive signs where less activity and signs that we are now starting to come down the other side of the curve.
We have 680 News.
Thanks, Levin. Dr. Davila or Mayor Tory, whoever is best qualified. So 7 million doses, great milestone. And I believe, Dr. Davila, I heard you say 92% double vax now?
For 12 years of age and older, just under 92.
That's amazing. So that surpasses the goal that you had always set. Now, with these thresholds being met, is there conversations about scaling down the vaccination effort, closing shops? The Metro Toronto Convention Centre, that was huge. It's closed. This is a small, cozy spot. This is open, and Mayor, I heard you mention that this is on the city's dime. This is your property, so this is a good, inexpensive operation. But is there a plan to scale things down?
Well, at this point, as you know, the province only recently announced the 4th dose campaign. And, there was a question just earlier to the mayor in respect of boosters. There's a certain proportion of our population that is just now becoming eligible for that 4th dose. So we see it as part of our role, along with other vaccination partners in the city, to make sure that opportunities to get the access to that next dose are readily available to residents of Toronto. Hence, we continue to have some presence here. As well, you heard the mayor speak to the fact that, look, COVID's not over yet. We have seen in other jurisdictions after a period of quiescence that there is, again, repeated activity, and there are still the conditions in place, unfortunately, for new variants to emerge. So part and parcel of this is ensuring that we're providing access to booster doses for which people are just becoming eligible for. We know that we're also hearing that there is still interest in first doses, as the mayor just mentioned in his remark. And then on top of that, I think we need to be ready for other, potential future activity for COVID. And we want to be in a good state of readiness, and certainly having places like these available and amazing staff like we have around us available to provide that vaccine on short notice is part and parcel of that readiness. I'll turn it over to the mayor to add his comments as well.
I will add none that can demonstrate any scientific expertise. I don't have any, but I am obviously charged as well with the responsibility, as is Dr. Davila, of making sure that we use the public's resources in as cost-effective a manner as possible. But the numbers we were presented with, for example, at our meeting on Tuesday this week, said there were something in the order of, I think, 120,000 people who in the next very short period of time, the next few weeks, will qualify for a fourth dose. So it's necessary when you're confronted with those kinds of numbers to maintain some of these mass immunization clinics in place. But I think over time we'll find, depending on, this is where again I get out of my realm of expertise, as we find that we might need to have different shots over time to deal with COVID as we do with many other things, that you'll rely, as we're trying to do now, more on the pharmacy network, on physicians in primary care to administer these vaccinations. But for now, when we face the task, for example, of having 100,000 people in the next few weeks, I think it is still safe and prudent, places health first, and cost effective for us to maintain these clinics in place and have the mobile clinics as well to go into, especially the neighborhoods where there's been some more reluctance to come out to these clinics to get vaccinated.
Okay, and then I'll use my follow-up just to be very specific. There are no plans to close any existing vaccination clinics at this time.
We rely on the expertise of Toronto Public Health and of Dr. Davila in that regard, because obviously we want to be, cost effective in terms of how we deploy the public's resources, but health comes first. And I think as long as we have that magnitude of people, and let's not forget, we still have several 100,000 people who need to have a third dose, as well as the 100,000 who qualify in the next couple of weeks for their fourth dose. So it justifies keeping these clinics open. But I will abide, as I have on all of these matters, by the advice received from Dr. Davila about what we need to deliver the vaccinations, and we will make sure the resources are available to deliver those. And we will let you know if we're going to plan to close any clinics based on her advice, with health coming first.
Thank you.
Okay, next up we have the Star.
Morning. My question is both for you, Mayor Tory and Dr. Davila. 7 million shots is great news, but uptake of third doses, particularly among youth aged 12 to 17, is still quite low, trailing at 28% according to the latest data. I know there has been some outreach to those populations. Are you reevaluating that strategy, and do you think there needs to be more targeted outreach to those specific groups?
One of the biggest challenges we faced, and Dr. Davila will tell you, I was one of the ones, perhaps not surprisingly to people, who would say, well, we have 6 groups that are sort of in need of more effort to get them vaccinated, and can't we focus on all 6? And I came to understand as we went through this that, in a big city like this where you have resources that are, limited, that you can focus on 1 or 2 at a time. And so, for example, on third doses, to use the example you gave, we focused, based on medical advice, on people who are 60 and above, because they were the ones who were at greatest risk based on the advice received from Toronto Public Health. So we focused more of our efforts there to make sure more of those people got a third dose. When you do that, that means you're not necessarily dedicating those same resources, because you can't do it twice, to the younger people. And so I would say the second instance where we dedicated efforts to third dose was in the marginalized communities, where the rate of vaccination there was way below the citywide average, which I think is about 57%. It was down, say, at 37%. So we abided by the health advice, and we did what we needed to do to focus on the groups that were most at risk or most under-vaccinated. And we obviously recognize the fact that young people present a specific challenge, both because I think over the entire course of the pandemic, some have concluded that this isn't really about me because I'm less likely to get it. I've read somewhere it's older people that get it, and so on. And also just because there are groups sometimes that are harder to reach in this regard. And I can only tell you that we don't ignore any of these groups, but we do have to set priorities, and we set the priorities based on the expert public health advice we get, and we will be continuing to focus on all of those groups, but having to do it in a certain way that sets priorities. And I'll turn the rest over to Dr. Davila.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. It's hard to add to that. So for the fact that he says that he's not a medical expert, that's true, but clearly he does listen very carefully when we discuss these issues on a regular basis. So the mayor is quite right that, with a fixed amount of resources, you focus your efforts on where you can get the most value for the resources invested. And at this point in time, also thinking about who was most impacted in terms of health outcomes and serious health outcomes associated with COVID-19 infection, we certainly did place our emphasis on the older segment of our population, just given that they were more prone to the more serious outcomes of COVID-19 infection. Along with them, those who are immune compromised. So certainly when it comes to the younger population, we focused efforts as well on those who have pre-existing conditions and who are at higher risk for more serious outcomes with COVID-19. That being said, we are out there in schools actually hosting clinics to make it readily accessible, to make vaccine readily accessible to children and youth, including those aged 12 to 17. And we're certainly doing everything we can to facilitate their ability to participate and to get that protective benefit of vaccine. So my message to all of Toronto is simply this. Please, right, get your next dose. It doesn't matter whether you're 12 or 17 or 70 to 80 plus years old. If you are eligible for another dose of vaccine, please take advantage of the many opportunities to get vaccine out there. One of our city-led clinics or Toronto Public Health clinics. We have mobile clinics out there. Our pharmacy partners are out there delivering vaccine, and so are many, many primary care providers in the city as well. It is the best thing we can all do together to see us through the other side of this wave and to successfully navigate this pandemic.
Thank you. Mayor Tory, you mentioned that there are 6 basically priority groups or outreach groups.
I think that was more of an illustrative number, but I mean, because there's probably 10, but we talk about probably 6 I could name readily, but yes, go ahead.
Okay. So you said right now, as 4th doses have begun to become available for individuals 60 and older, you're beginning to target that group right now. As eligibility expands for 4th doses, how will your strategy shift in terms of targeted groups and what
Well, again, it'll shift if it does on the basis of expert medical advice, but I would predict based on all the experiences we've been through so far that it will shift in the context more of focusing on neighborhoods where those getting a 4th dose in the targeted groups, which tend to be older, are not getting vaccinated. I mean, it's the gap, as we call it at our meetings, that has most concerned us all the way through, the gap that exists between those who get out on their own resources to get vaccinated quickly and those who do not. And there are barriers that stand in the way, different kinds of barriers for those who are in marginalized neighborhoods and so on. And so I would expect that as we get further into the 4th dose, our efforts will shift, as they have for the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st doses, to making sure that there aren't people left behind, and that the neighborhoods where there's much lower levels of the take-up of the 4th dose, knowing that the people who got that first are older people because they're more at risk. So I have learned a bit from listening carefully to Dr. Davila through 2 years of the pandemic, and that is that, the older you are, and in certain other kinds of conditions, the more you are at risk of having a severe consequence from getting COVID. So my guess is on the 4th dose, as the group expands, we will focus on, instead of the age group, we'll focus on people within the same age group that have, in their own neighborhoods, not got vaccinated because there are barriers that have stood in the way of that.
Okay, next up we have City News.
Over here, local medical officer in Ontario for province broader mask requirement. Dr. Davila, what's your thought on that?
So, I'm pleased to say that in Toronto, as I just mentioned earlier, that our circumstances here are absolutely improving. We are seeing over the last little while, our wastewater indicator is looking better. We're seeing, stabilization in respect of hospitalizations. That's not to take away from those who are in hospital or in ICU at this point in time. Those are very serious situations. But I would say that overall we're seeing an improvement. So at this point, my advice to people, and if you've been listening to me for the last several weeks now, I'm encouraging people to use the tools and knowledge that we have available to us. We are absolutely at a different point in the pandemic than we were even just as recently as a few weeks ago. And as I mentioned in my remarks this morning, we are certainly in a very different place than we were a year ago. That being said, what makes the most sense is for all of us to use the tools and knowledge that we have available to us now. That means getting the next dose of vaccine for which you're eligible as soon as you can. And there are lots of opportunities to make that happen, to stay home when you're sick. And absolutely, I am encouraging people to wear their masks. As you can see, I'm wearing mine. So when you're in indoor spaces with other people whose vaccination status is unknown to you, I think that this is a very reasonable course of action to take at this point in time. There is still COVID very much out there. It's especially important for people who are immune compromised and are at higher risk of negative outcomes associated with a COVID-19 infection. So it's all about using the tools that we have available to us, but I cannot overemphasize enough how important it is for people to get that next dose of vaccine. That's why we're here today, making sure that people know that this protective benefit of vaccine is available to them and that we're here to make it as easy as possible for them to take advantage of that.
Okay, I think we just have one more question from CP24.
Mayor Tory, we had making this discovery, the police chief that is, in Rosedale, the remains of a little girl, and police now trying to identify this child.
I have grandchildren in this age bracket. You know, they say this little girl is between 4 and 7 years old, and there's talk of little ponytails, just like my grandchildren have. And so, you know, my heart was broken when I read this and talked to the police about it. And all I can say is that my heart goes out to that child, no person should ever end up in a circumstance like that. And I would just use this as an opportunity, given the tragedy here, to ask the public to follow along with what the police have asked them to do. They've put some pictures on the internet, and it's the best we have. You know, the pictures of the blankets in which these remains were found. And somebody somewhere, because the blankets are distinct enough, somebody somewhere will know maybe those blankets, and then they might connect it to a little girl with ponytails between 4 and 7 years of age. And please help the police with this. This is how they solve a lot of these things. It's just that one thing that somebody knew or somebody saw or somebody, you know, thought they connected. Even if you think it's remote, please call it into the police and help them, because this is just an unspeakable tragedy. We don't know how it happened, obviously, and the police need to find that out. And the first step on that is to sort of see if people can use any of the evidence we do have to help solve this.
Okay, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.